And what a Sherpa is someone who knows the terrain, who's taken the journey, who's gone up before, and then leads others up, but they're still in it as they're going up. They're still susceptible to the same dangers as the rest of the climbers. And so there's something about what we do as disciple makers in creating that kind of, we're just a little further ahead. Maybe we've explored some of these paths, climbed a little bit, but we're still climbing with you and we're still susceptible to the same dangers. You're seeing this lived out and embodied in our lives as you walk with us.
Marcus Aurelius said, "What we do in life echoes through eternity." What is your life echoing through eternity? Welcome to Echoes Through Eternity with Dr. Jeffrey Skinner. Our mission is to inspire, engage, and encourage leaders from across the globe to plant missional churches and be servant leaders. So join us and hear the stories of servant leaders reverberating lives as God echoes them through eternity. Brought to you by Missional Church Planting and Leadership Development and Dynamic Church Planting International.
Welcome into Echoes Through Eternity. I am your host, Dr. Jeffrey D. Skinner. I am joined in studio today by Dr. Jeff Stark, an associate professor of Christian ministry at Olivet Nazarene University in Kankakee, Illinois, as well as the director of graduate programming at Olivet Nazarene University as well. Dr. Jeff has a brand new book coming out soon, I think around April or so, but we think Amazon may have leaked a few. So if you are living favorably for the Lord, you might be able to score a copy here or there. But officially, it shall be released around April through the Foundry, but you'll be able to find it all over the place where you can find books, including Amazon. But it's great to have Jeff here today. We want to talk about his book called The News is Good. And he's got a background now. We'll talk a little bit about that. But welcome in, Jeff. It's good to have you.
Jeff, it's great to be with you. And I appreciate the opportunity to share, talk a little bit about my passion, and to maybe share a little bit about why I wrote the book in the first place.
Yeah, I've not had a chance to read it because it's not available yet, but I did read your preview chapter, your chapter 1, and what I read there was really, really good. Very impressed with it. And before we get into that, just tell us a little bit about you and your background and kind of who you are, kind of give the listeners a little bit of your story.
Yeah, Jeff, that's great. Thank you so much. And, it's interesting because when I think about the book and my story, those are webbed and woven together. So my family would have called ourselves nominal Christians until I was about 10 years old. We would have gone to church. I teased my mom. I said, I think the only reason we really went to church is because they had a children's choir and you just really liked to listen to me sing. But around 10 years old, we just sort of departed. My dad traveled. He was on the road travel salesman. And so he was gone from Monday to Friday. We bought a boat during that time. And the boat kind of served as a connecting point for us as a family. And so it was really interesting, as I talk about reaching people who are distant from Jesus. I meet a lot of pastors who at times are fairly critical and harsh upon people who don't go to church. And I said, you never know the underlying story as to why. And so, for us as a family, with my dad being gone all the time, boat on the weekends served as our connecting point. And so it just was what it was. And so for, the next 15 years, I had very little to no interaction with the Christian faith at all. I made my way through high school and then into college, had a variety of different majors in college, but would have considered myself in college an atheist. And then I have a praying grandma who I joke and said, she had a conversation with me over at a truck stop diner one time that dialed me up from atheist to sort of a disinterested agnostic. And so in the midst of all of that, I was sort of the prototypical football playing, fraternity participating drunk in college. That was my sort of identity. And so I met my wife at a bar on my 21st birthday. We both had fairly dysfunctional sort of present reality, but also past. And so we thought, hey, take two alcoholics with dysfunctional pasts, completely immature, and then bring them together because obviously that's going to be a really healthy environment. So we ended up getting engaged, and I joined the military right out of college. I was graduating with an English literature degree and no teaching certificate with zero job prospects on the horizon. So I went down to the recruiter and said, do you have a place for me? And they said, absolutely. So I joined the military, spent the next year and a half in the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, learning Arabic. But my wife and I just spiraled in some significant ways down some really very broken and dysfunctional pathways. And I had two sons, both of them at various different points saved our marriage in significant ways. I deployed in 2001 to Macedonia and Kosovo. And it was during that time that things could not have gotten any worse. And during that time, my wife and I made a decision. We're done. When I get back from deployment, we're going to call it quits and have a divorce. And it was during that time that the Lord seized upon just a deep place of brokenness. I had two praying grandmas. And so I knew that when you got into trouble, you go to church. So I went to church one morning at a chapel. We were at a small post, an outpost. And so I went to chapel and nothing spectacular happened that morning. But that night when I went to bed, and, my timing is it's been, 23 years. So it might have been that night or the next night, but it was right around that exact same time. I felt I was pressed that I had to go back to the chapel. So at midnight one night, all alone in a chapel in Skopje, Macedonia, I had a radical encounter with God. And there was a rescue effort on God's behalf upon my life. It's not something I was looking for. God was looking for me, which is honestly one of the things that makes the news so good is that I didn't wake up one morning and go, I think God's a good idea. I think what makes the news so good is that God never stopped relentlessly pursuing me. That God is the initiative taker. And so it wasn't dependent upon me getting my act together. So God came and rescued me. And then in that rescuing, made a promise. As much as I understand or know how to speak about it today, there was an ultimatum in that moment that if I went with him, he would save my wife, my family, my marriage. I would spend the rest of my life serving him. If I didn't, everything would fall apart from that point forward. And so in my yielding, I yielded and God radically changed my life. I mean, it was a radical, radical transformation. Connected me with some absolutely amazing chaplains who began to disciple me. And then a month later, back in the States, completely disconnected from me, my wife went through a very significant and traumatic experience. And some friends of ours who happened to be Christian were there to pick her up. They took her to a Nazarene pastor's office where she knelt and received Christ as her Lord and Savior. And at that point, God began a work in our family that has played itself out over the last several years and connected us with a great church in Clarksville, Tennessee, where we were discipled and loved, where I started on staff. After I got out of the military, started on staff, served there for 7 years, served a wonderful, amazing, beautiful church in rural Tennessee for 5, served another great church for 5 years in Pekin, Illinois, and then spent 3 years as an urban missionary up in Chicago, wherein I've been teaching since 2019 here at Olivet as well. So that's a little bit
fantastic.
Of the short version. So
yeah, hey, I appreciate that. That's a great testimony too. I love that you said that God, started a rescue effort on your life. Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, I think I know your answer to this, but I'll go ahead and ask it anyway, just so that we have clarification for everybody else. You said that God made you a promise that if you'd follow him, that you'd have a great ministry together, a great life together beyond that. But if you didn't, things would just continue to spiral and fall apart. Did you see that as either you follow me or else, or how did you proceed? You use the word promise.
Yeah.
So unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So as much as I would have understood at the time, there was this beautiful assurance. Maybe that's a better word. There was a beautiful assurance that I felt in my spirit that the Lord was speaking something very clearly about his character and about his capacity. When I think back upon if you don't, everything falls apart for you. And I've thought about this a lot, actually. I never got a sense that God was standing over me, waiting to let me have it. It was almost in a sort of Romans kind of way. The wrath of God has been revealed because God has given them over to their desires, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, there's something about what is worse, a God who is just waiting there to give you the smackdown, or a God who lets you have your way. And our ways can be incredibly destructive. And so it was almost as if you're making your own bed and lying in it from this point forward. Yeah. And so that's kind of what I think I experienced in those moments.
Yeah, that's great. I want to give you a chance to clarify that, because I know there are some that do have that view of God. And I grew up with that view of God and know how, to me, it was not a healthy view of God. It was more of a view of Zeus than it was of Yahweh. And I don't think when we talk about the wrath of God that it is punitive in that sense. I think it is, as you said, that God gives us over to our desires. So look, if this is a natural consequence of selfishness, it is death. Do it your way, and follow your own path and your own desires, and they're not going to lead to a healthy place. Not that following me is going to lead you to health, wealth, and wisdom, but certainly, suffering with God, versus suffering without God.
Jeff, it's interesting when you talk about this, because for me, I always joke with my students and say, God's God's own problem. And what I mean by that is, when you look at, for instance, the story of Israel, we want a king to be like the other nations. And God says to Samuel, no, I don't think they do, because this doesn't go well. Samuel like, no, they really do. And God said, okay, well, here's what's going to happen. But God can't even stay out of the mess. Like, he allows them to create their own mess. And I think we always have to be reminded that the monarchy was a concession of God. It wasn't God's intentions on the front end. God conceded that to Israel. But the beauty of God's relentless pursuit of humanity is that even in allowing us to make the mess, God steps then into the mess with us. Yeah. God is never absent from those spaces. And that has been one of the things that I've consistently learned, even as I look back over my story, the story of dysfunctions, the story of brokenness, that when you look back, you can see the fingerprints of a loving God who has been tenacious and relentless in his pursuit. This for me is probably the reason why there's a few markers of Wesleyan theology that I think connects with me deeply, but maybe none more so than the understanding of prevenient grace, right? This idea of this grace that operates before, this grace that pursues, this grace that woos, this grace that draws, this grace that is at work before I can even know what to say about it, right? And like, that has been something that I've been able to point back to in my own life. But then also as I engage people in ministries, I engage people with conversations about Jesus, to realize that I don't have to bring Jesus to them, that I don't have to be the one who has started this process, that the onus of all responsibility doesn't fall upon my shoulders, but I am collaborating or partnering with God. And in that partnership, I'm finding and discovering how much God has already been at work.
Yeah, and continually at work. I think too often we think of salvation as this one decision that we make in our life. We say this sinner's prayer, and then, okay, we're done. And as you say, at least in a Wesleyan viewpoint, it is an ongoing process. It is here, but not yet. Kind of like the kingdom.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And not to segue too quickly to the book, but I just as a way of illustrating this. So the premise of my book is that the good news really is good news, right? This idea of the coming of the kingdom. Like, when Jesus proclaimed the good news, it wasn't just simply what I call a transactional theology where, we were bad, God sends Jesus who is good, who steps into timeout for us so that we don't have to. And no, like, the kingdom is breaking in, a new age is dawned, and you are included in this. You're invited into this newness. And in the invitation of this newness, you get a new kingdom and a new Lord and all that goes with that. That's good news, right? The challenge for us, and I think this is the way in which grace sustains us, and this is why I wanted to speak to this, is that we are consistently surrounded by bad news. And if we're not careful, if we don't tend to our spiritual lives well, if we don't lean into the regular work of the Spirit, then we are drawn into bad news stories, right? And so I think even the work of what happens in the church, even as we proclaim, even as we take and administer sacraments, those are consistent good newsing. Like, every time I step into the liturgical space of a church, and by that I mean the worshiping space. And I always differentiate that, because when I say worship, people think, well, yeah, we worship all the time. Yes, we do. But there's this distinct liturgical space that we gather. And in that distinct liturgical space, whatever that looks like for the church, there is good newsing happening again. And so I, as one who has spent my week bombarded by stories and voices and claims and demands upon my allegiance, am then thrust back into the story, where when I meet this story once again, and the Spirit of God is at work once again, and the grace of God is present once again, that I am then captivated and compelled and drawn back again into this good news. And so the good newsing, the evangelism, the work of transformation, the participation in the grace of God is that ongoing process that you're speaking.
And that leads me to this question here. I was reading, again, the one chapter that you had available there. You said that discipleship making isn't a formulaic multi-step program. Instead, true and effective evangelism is an honest way of doing life alongside those with whom we already find ourselves in community. I read that and I wanted to shout amen. So often we have, and nothing wrong with a discipleship study, nothing wrong with those things, but discipleship becomes a program instead of a way of life.
Yes. Yes. So, yeah, yeah, and thank you for pulling that out. So, and again, that's part of the premise of the book as well, is that in many respects, we have to destigmatize evangelism and we have to make discipleship much more rooted in the daily life, right? The experiences of my daily life, rather than it being a particular event that I go and participate in on occasion. And instead of evangelism being this ministry of the church or the specific calling of a certain group of people. Because the subtitle of the book is Evangelism as a Way of Life, right? So it's this idea that we have to see ourselves wherever we live, work, and play as always reflective, bearing witness to this good news, the kingdom of God on earth as it is heaven, which means that every interaction I have, every relationship that I am in, I am bearing witness to the good news. Now, that doesn't mean that I am, quote unquote, laying down a track or trying to get someone saved at every occasion. That means that I'm establishing meaningful, generous, compassionate, empathetic, loving relationships in hopes that in seeing my life lived authentically in a very real way, that they will see within me something that would be compelling enough that they would say, what is it about you and why are you the way you are? And in that, we're able to, and this is what I actually say this in the book, is that our opportunity to then give voice to the good news bubbles to the surface when we've been faithful in embodying that good news. And the implications of that we are, in a sense, discipling before we evangelize. Like, especially in a post-Christian, pre-Christian context that many of us are finding ourselves in, people are walking with us. We're kind of apprenticing them even before they arrive at the point where they know what they're saying yes to. And then when we say yes, or we give it an opportunity to clarify through our proclamation of what this good news is, they've seen the demonstration of that. And so it puts a greater responsibility, I think, upon us to see how is it when I go to the factory floor, when I go to the office, when I go into the classroom that I teach in, how is it that my life in any ways lived compellingly enough that people would say, I want that. I'm interested in that. So that's kind of daily lifestyle is so valuable for us.
You can be a co-creator with God by helping to echo our guest voices, share our episodes with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Give us positive 5-star reviews. The more positive reviews we have, the more visibility we have, and the more voices that are echoed through eternity. We often invite guests who are serving faithfully year after year, often in anonymity in their respective roles and ministries. God sees them, and the reality is for a good kingdom leader, that's enough. We do not do what we do for the accolades of humanity. We do it because we're called by God. But I believe that God uses people like you and I to continue those reverberations and echo them throughout eternity. You can partner with God by liking, subscribing, writing a quick positive 5-star review, and again, sharing those voices with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Those reviews will eventually lead to other guests who have larger platforms that have more listeners who will then in turn listen to the show. And again, it further echoes those voices, which is the whole vision of the Echoes Through Eternity podcast here, is to continue echoing those voices that God is echoing through eternity there. So like and subscribe and review us if you would. We'd appreciate that greatly. Yeah. It's almost like we're living out that prevenient grace that Wesley talks about in our discipleship. In that we're discipling before they ever make a decision, so to speak. We're offering that grace to them before they ever know what grace really is.
Yes, that's right. I have one of the sections of the book is called "Can I Get a Witness?" And I love Matthew 28. Don't get me wrong. Go therefore in all nations, making disciples. Right. I love as you're going, which I think we always forget that as you're going, go do that. And I love Matthew 28. I am specifically compelled by Acts chapter 1. And you will be my witnesses. Your lives will reflect the good that you have seen in me, you will be to the world. In this section of the book, we talk about a compelling, credible, patient, just witness, right? So like our lives have to be, one, compelling. That's something about us, the way that we interact. And this is the early church's form of evangelism. See, we forget this, right? We think about, because we're so accustomed to sort of transactional presentations. The early church, their evangelism strategy was to do community really well. Like the way, and if there's this great book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by Alan Kreider. And he talks about how the early church's evangelistic sort of formula was, we're going to love one another really well, and we're going to love the people who come into the sphere of our influence really well. And it's that love embodied in community that is going to be what people are going to long for. So it was the way in which they were compelling in their witness. And then this idea of credible, right? So we have to be credible. And we actually, in the Wesleyan tradition, have a language for credibility, and that language is holiness. And because it's a consistency, right? Credibility is born of consistency and trust. Can I trust that who you say you are, that you're going to be who you are everywhere you are, right? And are you going to be there in your authenticity? When you falter, when you fail, when you stumble, when you misstep, when you say something hurtful, when you hurt someone's feeling, are you going to act accordingly, right? And then it's this idea of patient witness that, and I think we forget this. This is the part that our transactional theology has impacted us too greatly. I'll tell you a quick story here from the book. 2 weeks back to back, a few years ago, I was in 2 different denominational settings in which the parable of the sower was used, right? This idea of some cast on hard path and among the rocks and in the weeds, and then some bore out a great and fruitful yield. And in both cases, and I was feeling a little bit persnickety at the time. So, and I can be, when I'm persnickety, I don't keep my mouth shut. And so I raised my hand up and I said, that sower is a cop-out for way too many of us in this room. And they said, what do you mean? I said, because we're always complaining that we didn't get the good yield soil. I said, that's not how evangelism in a post-Christian context works. I said, it's not about trying to get the good soil. I have never planted a garden where I didn't have to first till the land, where I didn't have to cultivate the soil. Like every house that I've ever bought that I've planted a garden, there was only a patch of grass. Like I wasn't tossing seed on grass. Like I had to pull out the tiller, and then I had to pull out the rocks, and then I had to condition the soil, and then I had to provide the nutrients. Our witness is what cultivates in people's lives their openness to the good news of Jesus. So it's kind of walking through and helping people understand, like, this is how our lives exist together in pursuit of this good news.
You're right. I mean, I like Matthew 28 too. And I remember the first time I recognized it was as you go, it was not this going. And that's really a reflection of the rabbinic relationship that Jesus had with his followers.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Just so I've developed a really good friendship with a church. It's a multi-site church up in Chicago called Community Christian. And they're very involved in church planting, very involved in Exponential, New Thing Network. And John and Dave Ferguson, who are the co-founding pastors of the church, they use the language of apprenticing a lot.
Yeah.
And I love the language of apprentice for disciple making, because apprentice speaks to this sort of action, right? Like this recognition. Now, here's the unique thing. Is that as people who apprentice others, we're still novices chasing down the master, right? There's only one master. So none of us are experts in this field. We just happen to be a little further ahead than others. And I've been using the language a lot in terms of discipleship. I've been using the language Sherpa a lot because I'm fascinated by people who have climbed mountains that I will never climb, nor do I have an interest. But it's the journey themselves. And each one of them will talk about the specific relationship that they have with their Sherpas. These Sherpas are valued incredibly by people who climb the Everests of the world, right? And what a Sherpa is someone who knows the terrain, who's taken the journey, who's gone up before, and then leads others up, but they're still in it as they're going up. They're still susceptible to the same dangers as the rest of the climbers. And so there's something about what we do as disciple makers in creating that kind of, we're just a little further ahead. Maybe we've explored some of these paths, climbed a little bit, but we're still climbing with you and we're still susceptible to the same dangers. You're seeing this lived out and embodied in our lives as you walk with us.
Yeah, good. So I know you and I were talking before the podcast, and you mentioned that you started a church within a church and worked a lot with the addiction community and things like that. So how does that discipleship process work in accountability and calling them out of quote unquote sinful behavior, so to speak? And how do you work out that loving relationship and accountability and calling them out of that sinful process, post-Christian world there? How does that work?
Man, that's such a great question. So I would say the first thing we have to remember is that this has to be deeply embedded within the fabric of relationships, right? And so we had a Celebrate Recovery ministry, which I'm a huge advocate as someone who, when I came to faith, came out of an addictive background, having gone through CR. There's nothing magical about CR, but it has been a tool and a vessel through which God has used and worked in my life. We had a CR at our church, and the work that I was doing at our church, one of the areas that I worked in, often had me doing some street ministry. I was a volunteer intake counselor at the drug rehab facility there in town, and I just had a heartbeat. And so a lot of these relationships already existed for me. And so we started our Saturday night church. Many of these individuals, folks either from the day shelter that we had forged relationships with or from the drug rehab facility, they're like, Jeff, we need something positive, something healthy on Saturday night. So we want to come. So at first I had a gentleman who would drive the van for me, who unfortunately ended up with ALS. And so I ended up driving my own van. So I was joking with people. And I said, to get people to come to my first church that I planted, I had to go pick them up and bring them. So, but it was,
it's children's ministry, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so, but all of this was relationships. So I think we need to think, and I'm going to use this as an example, maybe as to how I understand relationships. So
yeah,
I was with them throughout the week. We saw the difficulties, recognized the hardships, spoke into their lives throughout the week. We had earned the right and the ability, because of our extended relationship, that when one of them was journeying down one of their very broken paths, we could speak into that. So we had one gentleman by the name of Jerry who would at times come to church on Saturday nights drunk. And when he would come, I would speak into that and say, Jerry, okay, like you can be here, but I'm going to call you out if you start getting a little rascally. And he trusted my heart in that because we had spent time together. So I would pick these individuals up. I'd bring them to church. And then after church, I want to tell you one of the most profound and beautiful experiences. After church, the only time that they all really got out to have what we would consider to be normal life was on Saturday nights. And so we had to pass the Dairy Queen on the way back to the drug rehab facility where I have to drop them off. So we'd always stop and we'd always get small blizzards. And they only ever had just a little bit of money because they worked as a part of this drug rehab facility. But nobody in the van who didn't have any money wouldn't get a blizzard. Everybody got a blizzard, no matter who had to pay for it. Somebody was getting a blizzard. And we'd have these meaningful conversations and we'd be sharing these blizzards. And I was thinking to myself, this is Eucharistic, right? Like we're doing communion right here.
Yeah, I love that.
And so in this, there's these profound moments of revelation, of speaking life, of challenging assumptions. These are people that we would take out to breakfast and that would do lunch. And I think that's one of the things you have to remember. So my friends who were a part of this church plant, they were going, and they would also come on Sunday mornings to our larger church as well. These were folks that went out to lunch with my family. So like my friends who were a part of the drug rehab facility and the homeless, like these weren't just them and us. Like we would sit and have Mexican food after service, and they would be sitting right next to my sons who were at the time 6 and 7 years old. And we saw them as a part of our extended family, which I think then enables us to call into question some of the assumptions, to provide for them the resources, to walk with them. I remember when I took Jerry down to an extended treatment center, and the journey getting there, the fear that he had, the apprehension that he went through, but ultimately his entrusting me with the opportunity to say, no, this has to happen for your well-being. So I think those are all key.
Yeah, good. I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Within the context of relationship, too often we want to take and I hesitate to. I don't want to disparage previous forms of evangelism or anything like that because they were doing what they felt were faithful at the time. So the sidewalk ministries, standing out front of the ball games or wherever it is with the PA system or just standing there with your turn and burn message, maybe they felt like they were being faithful at the time. But times change. As the times change, the message changes. And so perhaps in the 70s and the 60s, that turn and burn message worked. But today, I think part of it has to do with, it goes back to that trust and the credibility. And so many levels of everything, society in general has failed at this point. We used to trust in our governments, and governments have failed us. Politicians fail us. Everything that God warned Israel about in Kings has come true.
That's right.
They tax us. They take our children to war.
Yeah, that's right.
They use our land. All those things have absolutely come true. And 2,000 years later, we believe him now.
Yeah.
Okay, yep, you're right. We've made our bed. We're laying in it. Okay, so how do we get out of this mess? Well, we got to trust you. So we recognize the government has failed us. Education has failed us. Parents have failed. Every part of society is failing us at this point, being deconstructed. And so to say you were a pastor in the 70s, you had some credibility just by saying you were a pastor. But in an age of so many public figures of churches and pastors, and I don't have to name anything specifically, we just know they're there. We no longer have credibility just by saying we're a pastor. And so I think we have to build that relationship in order to have credibility. And then based upon that credibility, now we have the ability to call out, hey, look, it's not a matter of heaven or hell. It's a matter of life and death here. And the path that you are on leads to death. In my chaplaincy, I work a lot with people that are chaplain a lot in chicken plants. And chicken plants are dirty. Chicken guts everywhere. They're cold. They're damp. It just smells. You don't grow up dreaming of working in a chicken plant, right? It's good money. It's the only place I know you can make $22 an hour, 60 hours a week, and have a criminal record. But you have a lot of folks in there that are in drug rehab and things like that. And it's kind of interesting to watch that process. When they first come in, they're very anxious when they're first started because they'll go to the drug rehab and it's like a halfway thing. So they get the job at the chicken plant. And so it's kind of structure for them. Because they're very anxious when they first come in. They're very open for the chaplain because they're so desperate. And so you talk to them about their treatment and us going, okay, 6 months into it, they're not anxious about the treatment. They absolutely love waking up sober and knowing where they were the day before. What they're anxious about is getting out, entering back into that normal life there. And so, I get to have the conversations with them. Okay, what is it going to look like for you when you get out? Where are you going to live? Who are you going to be around? Obviously, you got to change your friends, change your environment. You won't go back to that same place you were. But it's just interesting to hear those people talk about that experience there. And they don't talk about heaven or hell. The hell that they, 6 months into it, that they were living was that addiction, right? So I love the fact that you talk about it in the context of relationship, that we call them not out of hatred or even condemnation, but out of love. We want something better for you. And which is what God was saying to you. I have something better for you if you just follow me. It's not that if you don't follow me, I'm going to punish you, but here's a better way. Take your finger out of the light socket so that you don't get electrocuted there. Great conversation there. I look forward to reading your book. Be the first ones to purchase it when it actually is available for real on Amazon there. So I appreciate that. I did have another question for you. So you planted a church within a church. How do you incorporate that in the evangel? Well, let me back up, Matt. Our evangelism strategy today, or the evangelism strategy in the 60s and 70s, I look at that. Where do you think it was born out of? It's almost and I don't want to get into politics here, but it's almost a colonization mentality there where we're going to take our way. I like the way the Church of Nazarene has changed our approach to missions. It used to be we wanted to train them and teach them the language and all that before they went in there, and so that they would be experts on everything. Now they say, no, we just want you to go in, and it forces them to be vulnerable. And in vulnerability, you build relationships with the culture there, and you have to learn that culture and things like that. So I like that strategy for today. To talk a little bit about that. I didn't ask that question. Well, talk to me a little bit about that.
I think I'm understanding what you're saying here. And so I'm going to answer it probably in a different way.
Sure.
So when I'm working with my students and when I'm working with our master's degree students, and I teach a variety of different courses, and there's some overlap in the courses. But one of the claims that I make consistently is that all Christian leadership, and in many ways, if you are someone who is living out your faith in a way that is apprenticing other, you're leading people, right? And I say, all Christian leadership operates against the backdrop or the canvas of our lives is kenosis, is this idea of self-emptying, right? This is not something we've done well. And understandably, because the Christendom model And for those of you who are listening, Christian model is the model that most of us have just assumed as a part of sort of our Christian imagination, is that within the West, Christianity is the dominant force. We even use that language. We have a language that is very power saturated.
Yeah.
And we have found ways to justify and rationalize why that power saturation should be or is meaningful, right? And I think at times have failed to realize is the real consequences and implications of that power saturation, that language of being in control, that language of even in our best intentions, we have too readily created these dualisms of us, we're the good ones, we're the educated ones, we're the civilized ones, we're all of those things that we say about ourselves, and them, they're not. So it's incumbent upon us, our Christian duty, and you'll actually see this language show up historically, is to then take what we have and give it to them so that they can be more like us.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of power saturation, this idea of who's in control, whose responsibility, whose duty, and then what are we taking with us? And we're not always just taking with us Jesus. We're taking with us forms of politics and forms of economics and forms of cultural assimilation, all of those things. Now, this is very, very different than how we understand the Gospels to play out, which is that God became flesh. Jesus draped himself with the vulnerability of humanity. He came low. He became one with us. And Gorman, in his book about the cruciform life, talks about kenosis. And he says, we tend to think about kenosis, this Philippians chapter 2 passage, that God emptied himself out, right? That he made himself nothing. He took on the very form of a servant. We should have the same attitude, which is also Christ Jesus. That whole passage from Philippians 2. He says, we tend to think about that as a one-time event in the life of God, that God does this in Jesus one time. And he actually claims that this is, if you trace through the history of the scriptures, this is God's character. God is a God who empties God's self out, right? A God who makes God's self vulnerable. And so I think for us to do evangelism and missions well in this world, we have to come to terms with how poorly we've been canonic and how much we have to empty of ourselves of our presumption. And even if we're going to talk about power, which not all power is bad, but power, this is where meekness comes, right? Meekness is power under check, right? It's not just no power at all, but that our power is then leveraged and our influence is leveraged for the sake of the kingdom of God and not the kingdoms of man, which I think we tend to get those two crossed up from time to time.
Yeah. Good. Fantastic. Well, Jeff, it has been a privilege to talk with you. And I, again, look forward to reading your book. I've followed you over the years remotely, so to speak, just at a distance and watched your ministry and watched you flourish and how God has used you. I encourage you, if you're listening today, to pick it up. It's called The News is Good. It will be available on Amazon for pre-order. And you can get it through the Foundry, which is, I don't know that website off the top of my head, the Foundry.
I don't have that off the top of my head either,
I think it's called the foundrypublishing.com or something like that. But anyway, get it there. Anywhere books are sold, you can get it there. One last thing. I know you do some coaching as well. And so I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your coaching ministry. And if you've got a website for that, let us know what that is. I'll put that in the notes. So plug that a little bit for us.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. When it comes to coaching, I don't have a website. And part of this has just been word of mouth. So I can sum up my coaching very quickly, which is this. I'm at a stage in my life where I want to help people do better and be better at the things that they're most passionate about. That's my life, is that God has afforded me ample opportunities over the last 20 years to serve him in just some really exciting and fun ways. And yet there was always this hunger in me to not make this about the things that I was doing, but to be about the things that others were doing. And so I've moved in this stage of my life where I love nothing more than to linger in the background and to come alongside of people, either in the moments of organizational growth or change or even personal sort of development, and just saying, hey, how can I walk alongside of you in this season and provide for you an opportunity to speak, to share, to vent, but then a place to process so that we can be a little bit more strategic about the next steps we take forward. So that's what all of my coaching desire comes from.
Fantastic. All right, Jeff. Well, I appreciate it again, and you have a blessed day, and we'll talk to you again soon. You can be a co-creator with God by helping to echo our guest voices, share our episodes with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Give us positive 5-star reviews. The more positive reviews we have, the more visibility we have, and the more voices that are echoed through eternity. We often invite guests who are serving faithfully year after year, often in anonymity in their respective roles and ministries. God sees them, and the reality is for a good kingdom leader, that's enough. We do not do what we do for the accolades of humanity. We do it because we're called by God. But I believe that God uses people like you and I to continue those reverberations and echo them throughout eternity. You can partner with God by liking, subscribing, writing a quick positive 5-star review, and again, sharing those voices with friends and family and on your own social media accounts. Those reviews will eventually lead to other guests who have larger platforms that have more listeners who will then in turn listen to the show. And again, it further echoes those voices, which is the whole vision of the Echoes Through Eternity podcast here, is to continue echoing those voices that God is echoing through eternity there. So like and subscribe and review us if you would. We'd appreciate that greatly.